This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton. Buck, I generally start out by quizzing you about, you may
my
have
aspirations. I know.
The
Yes.
White House still beckons. I hope you consider, how many more years is it? Another 3 years or so? Could you just be drafted possibly?
They know where to find me.
Okay, all right. On that note, if anyone is watching, in the same, maybe I should hold myself out for some possibilities.
Well,
I'm getting older though. I don't know if they get the older guys in there.
Well, which one of us will be the vice presidential?
We could flip a coin
Yes,
for
okay,
that.
we
We
could
could
do
flip a coin. Well, we've talked about a lot of things in our conversations, and one of the great stains on the national psyche is slavery. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that as a terrible part of the human condition, how the country is adjusted to that. We still are trying to adjust to it, how it happened, and maybe take a journey into that painful subject. But maybe I can start out by saying that in general, slavery has just been part of the human condition.
Ubiquitous.
It's everywhere, and it generally, the strong, big dogs control the little dogs and then sort of abuse them in a way for their own benefit. Is that a general statement about our species?
It is. If you look at human history, most of the people you meet on the street in America, irrespective of skin color, are descended from slaves, because slavery has just been so widespread, and usually in most cultures it has not been race-based. So I think all of us have slaves in our family tree.
Well, it's almost impossible not to, isn't
Yes.
that right? So if you're if you're a Caucasian, your ancestors are from the United Kingdom, well, you're probably a serf there, a peasant, and the preponderant number of people that came here in the 17th centuries from Europe were basically serfs, and a huge percentage of them came as indentured servants, which was kind of a form of a temporary bondage, you could say. Obviously it's not as nothing like the true slavery,
Yes.
but something like that.
I would call it contract-based. Now, you could argue whether or not an indentured servant, when he agreed to enter the indenture, had an inequality of bargaining power, which would have been more.
Maybe they needed a
unwilling
good
bondage.
lawyer. Well,
So, yes.
So in general, we've discussed before, there was no income redistribution anywhere. So if you to have bread, you had to get your bread from somewhere, and then people might even sell themselves into slavery just to be able to eat. All the cultures were dependent upon it, particularly the Greeks. The origin of democracy depended on slave labor. The Romans had huge numbers of slaves. St. Augustine, when he saw the Anglo slave and the slave market in Rome, said, "Wow, these guys are Angles, not Angles, but angels," and so they helped Christianize England. So everywhere, slavery. The Slavic people were called slaves. That was the name of all these people were slaves. People just did that routinely. They would one dominant group would destroy another group and take every one they could to be of use to them. So it's a terrible way that our species has functioned, but that's the story. And we might discuss what was going on when the Europeans started their transoceanic travel. So they found themselves in possessions of great power as they sailed around the world, and they came upon societies that were far beneath them in their power. Do you have any comments about that? What happened there? It was the Europeans generally did not treat the people they found as brothers. Is that a fair statement?
Well, as my wife, Dr. Carol Melton, always likes to say, history is not the story of people being nice to each other. And for whatever fluke of nature, this appendage of the Asian continent that we know of as Europe managed to reach a degree of technological sophistication in the 1400s, 1500s, down to the 1800s that really eclipsed anything else anywhere on Earth. And in the 1400s, they began these voyages of discovery. And one of the chief directions before they headed westward across the ocean was simply down the west coast of Africa in an attempt to circumnavigate Africa and make it directly to the Asian spice markets. And when they got to sub-Saharan Africa, they find a different people who are living at a much more primitive level, who are obviously different from they are. I mean, that people are different, and maybe you can speak to this. The reptile brain seems programmed to distrust or be fearful of any other individual who obviously belongs to a different tribe. And one of the clearest, most visible, obvious markers of different tribe would be skin color. You can see it from a distance. It can't be covered up. And I mean,
although
yeah.
actually, and there's relatively little genetic difference between any the Homo sapien races, if you want to say that. There are just a very few genes, out of trillion, well, many thousands are referable to skin color. But it's fair enough that an obvious difference causes the groups to mistrust one another. I think that's instinctive. Just a difference in appearance provokes this, and certainly if one society is more technically more advanced than another, then obviously the more advanced society believes the society that's not so advanced technically they have some innate superiority.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that took place was the Islamic world was they had lots and lots of slaves, and there was a great, huge war between the Islamic and Christian world, and there was a struggle for souls. And the one, at least, justification, I think, of the European incursion into West Africa was, besides whatever else was there, well, if we take some slaves, we'll Christianize them, and if the Islamic people take them, they'll turn them into Islamic people, and thus we have there's a moral justification for what we do, and besides the economic one. In any event, in this set of circumstances that occurred in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, there was ancient DNA behind it. This was the state of mankind. People would make references to the Bible where servants, or one could say slaves, were mentioned throughout the Bible. So the idea was, well, this is okay. Christianity in some way condones it to some degree, and we're taking these souls away from the Islamic people. And then the next part of the little story is this was a reservoir of human labor in West Africa, and the mercantile forces in Western Europe needed the workers, to use the wrong word, in the New World. And so this slave trade grew up, and we're racing through a lot of complicated things here. But thousands of people were sold into bondage. And if I can say this, the way this took place, is my understanding, was that the African princes, that they would have weaker neighbors, and they would then take the people that came under their control and take them to the coast and then sell them to European traders. So there was that sort of arrangement was taking place in a preponderant way. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. Yes, when you have, once you have the first sustained contact between Europe and the American continents, you have what historians like to call the Columbian exchange, with various animals, plants, diseases moving back and forth from one to the other. The potato goes to the old world, the tomato goes to the old world. Domesticated animals go from the old to the new world.
Which way did the squirrels came somehow? Did we send the squirrels there?
I think
the
the
gray
squirrels may have been around all over.
No, there's something
sure.
squirrels.
Yes.
One kind of squirrel came,
yes.
knocked the other one off. But okay.
And then, of course, cats came from Eurasia. But at any rate, the Caribbean.
Yes.
excellent climate for growing various terrific cash crops, sugarcane, for instance, being a good example. And of course, in an age before off and raid and air conditioning, the climate was absolutely murderous, devastating to northern Europeans, whereas Africans were from a tropical environment and could stand the heat, colloquially and literally, rather better than Europeans could,
yeah.
As well as being a great source of labor. Labor is the source of capital.
So one of the things that happened as an experiment in the 17th century is the idea was to take some of those European peasants and send them over in a state of indentured servants or contract laborers to go to Barbados, which is a great sugar island. I think the first settlers there were really these sort of European peasants. The idea was they would grow the sugar cane. And then the idea of using African slaves appeared that wasn't working out too well with this source of labor. And I think the Portuguese and the Spanish employed this in their colonies. And the preponderant number, as my understanding, the preponderant number of African slaves really went to Brazil, South America, the Caribbean, and relatively less of a number to North America. Is that a fair?
Yes, because that's where the really big cash crops were very early on, and that's also where you had really high mortality rates, because even the Africans who were better acclimated to the climate couldn't beat the excess mortality rates. You had to keep importing them because they simply could not sustain the population locally.
This is rather brutal. The whole experience turned out to be quite brutal, and there was not any kind of checks at all on this. There was not any. The government was not assessing anything, and there was nothing. It was just a total economic arrangement without any ethical input into it all. It was a total money-making proposition. Correct. With no extension of humanity. I think that's a fair statement. And I think one reason might be that the Christians thought that non-pagans maybe had less cachet, if you want to say it that way, in the human condition. So these weren't really totally human people. They weren't Christians. They didn't look the same. They couldn't understand their language. Their behavior, as far as the Europeans could tell, seemed inappropriate. And so they felt that maybe justified in abusing these people. Is that maybe that's one could say that.
There's always justification in that regard, even if they don't actually feel it.
And of course, I used a small word to say abuse, but okay, much worse than that. Well, one of the things that now we finally get to the American experience, which is sort of our subject in a way. The first, we mentioned before, they attempted to use European peasant labor in the West Indies. It didn't work too well. And I think they tried the same in Virginia. So the indentured servants that were coming over, and then it took a while before the black slaves arrived there, and they rapidly became the sine qua non of a whole plantation culture. So it was impossible to make things work without the slave labor.
Yes, the first Africans arrived in 1619. Probably brought by a Dutch ship. The Dutch were, I like to describe the Dutch in the 1600s and the early 1700s as the FedEx of Europe. They would haul anything anywhere for a price and were quite good at it. The first Africans probably, when they arrived here, were treated as indentured servants, but by the end of the century had been reduced. Their indentures had been extended to the term of their entire lives.
Now, we get into an interesting legal story. My understanding is that progressively the codes that restrained black slaves became more and more onerous. So as you mentioned, firstly, there was there was no particular legal code. There was a sort of a confusion about their status. And then it became increasingly restrictive. Is that right? Everywhere. They're terrifically restrictive code.
Yes, and it's interesting because for the first 30 or 40 or 50 years, oftentimes Africans, or by this time we would call them African Americans, had a similar legal status. But as competition, as labor competition got tougher and tougher, A lot of white working class people resented the competition and therefore managed to prevail on getting the government to start extending the indentures of Africans and just simply cut them out of the free labor market altogether. And at that point, you have full-blown slavery with Africans having, or African Americans having no rights whatsoever. They were people who were being treated as articles of property.
And there we have we've sort of hit upon the great conundrum in our national history, is that we have on one hand, we have a progressive Enlightenment viewpoint about humans, freedom, liberty, all the great storied words that made the country special. So the idea is this is a special place. It's got a third covenant. If you come here, you can act in a moral way. You have this. The whole continent is yours. Yeah, you might have been a serf in Europe, or maybe you were an oppressed minority. If you come to the U.S., everything is going to be great for you, with the exception of a tremendous slave population who were not entitled to any of these benefits. And it's a right away a huge paradox, and how the country resolved that paradox is, and still attempts to resolve the paradox, is part of our national, I guess, psyche as to how we deal with this.
Yes. If I could interject right here for a minute, I think one of the best emblems of this tension, going back to that year 1619, within that same year 1619, you see the formation of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is the first self-representative body by Europeans in the New World, to my knowledge. And so within that same year, about 500 yards away from each other, you have the founding of self-government, and you have the seeds laid for the institution of slavery. And I think that's emblematic of that tension.
No, that's right. And so this, and how it just really quite a difficult story to make an understatement of it. Well, okay, so the country went through the crisis that we don't have to recapitulate. We had mentioned earlier, there's so much to talk about. We'll maybe jump to the Confederate Constitution. We'd had a little conversation about that. So one could say, what caused the Civil War? Was it that states' rights was part of it, or this is the Declaration of Independence, or was it, as many people would say, just the idea of preserving the institution of slavery? What did the Confederate Constitution talk about, which is a subject that's not so commonly addressed?
Yes. Well, a lot of people, a lot of Southern apologists like to say that this was not about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about the tariff. It's really a perfect storm of causes. It was the desire to defend slavery through, I think, a perfectly legitimate mechanism of state sovereignty. But the two things together are what form this perfect storm.
So legally,
yes.
From the point of just a legal doctrine, if once these facts were in evidence from a legal point of view, not a moral point of view, but a legal point of view, then it was quite a quite rational direction. Not counting the ethical part of it.
It was. And if I'm not mistaken, and this is where I think the people who say that slavery was not a major cause of the war are mistaken, that every seceding state, when it passed its ordinance of secession or gave a statement as to why, an official statement as to why it had passed an ordinance of secession, I believe every one of those official statements made reference to slavery and the fear that the federal government was going to interfere with slavery.
As they done in Kansas and Nebraska, that was at least the tensions there about, well, I'm a slave owner, I should be able to take my slaves anywhere.
Yes. Well, that was it. The big debate was, it was perfectly clear under the federal Constitution that the federal government could not tell a state that it could not have slavery. Just as today, they have casinos in Nevada and they don't have casinos in South Carolina. We allow radar detectors in Georgia. They don't allow radar detectors in Virginia. It was entirely up to the state government. The problem was, what about, as the country continued to move west, slavery in federal territory? because the one way that you could abolish slavery in one fell swoop would be to pass a constitutional amendment banning slavery everywhere. But to do that, 3/4 of the states, 75% of all states, would have to ratify that amendment. So as we moved west, the question is, would slavery move west into the federal territories as well? If it did not, ultimately those federal territories would become free states. And if you got to that magic 75% mark, all of those new free states could force the South to end slavery. And so that was where the fighting was about, what the fighting was about.
So we have a lot of, this is obviously such a huge topic. We're just skating along the surface. What efforts were undertaken? I mean, Thomas Jefferson called slavery the fireball in the night. All the great fathers of the Republic were aware of this contradiction. And what sort of efforts were underway? What was going on? Slavery was initially quite legal in northern states, and the northern states were making it illegal. There was a history of that taking place, and I think some of what goes on now is some of the universities that are liberal bastions of liberalism. In the past, they owned slaves. There were slaves around, but gradually in the North, there was no economic incentive to have this, and they were one state after the next was making it illegal. Is that right?
Yes, you could originally find slavery as far north as Massachusetts, and interestingly enough, in Massachusetts, nobody quite knew if or when slavery had been abolished. You could make an argument that technically slavery was still legal in Massachusetts as late as the 1830s or 1840s. Now, there weren't any slaves there. But you're right, it was just not economically viable there. So it became the peculiar institution, something, not the strange institution, but peculiar to the South, and you got this tremendous tension between North and South over slavery. And there were even Southern abolitionists early on. How do we live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal? But once cotton culture came in and made slavery such a lucrative thing, that died out very quickly, and abolitionism became a thing of the North.
So in a way, if the cotton culture had not occurred, there might have been sort of a self-limited arrangement. Gradually, the sort of ethical underpinning of the country might have done something that would not have required this destructive war.
There's an excellent chance of that, yes.
Now, another thing that happened is people, they had their different emancipation ideas out there. The idea of establishing African Americans returning to Africa in these sort of protected areas. Liberia is one of them.
Yes.
There are different schemes for emancipation, different ideas.
Yes, the American Colonization Society actually did return about 15,000. Well, this is the question: sending the slaves back to Africa. If you are an African American and you speak English, and
quite a
you were never in
experience, wouldn't it?
Your parents were never even in Africa; they came from the Caribbean.
Right. It would be quite a.
It's like sending me back to Germany. I'm mostly German.
Right.
Yes,
It would be a difficult situation.
Yes.
Well, so the scheme did not work.
Mm-hmm.
So these different ways were employed to, I guess, different ideas. Now the British went through. It's my understanding they just emancipated everyone in their colonies in the 1830s, and they just paid everyone, the slave owners, some money, and then they went through a process where the slaves would have to work for some period of time, and then they would be free.
Yes.
So that actually, all of the slaves of the British Empire were freed by the certainly by 1838. 38, they were freed. And so the British had enough money to do this, and their system worked where the Parliament was kind of in control of this situation, and the people that lived in Jamaica really didn't have a vote in Parliament. Correct. So they just said, "Well, we think this is immoral. We'll just do that."
Yes, and this is something that we couldn't do in America, but there was discussion along those lines. The idea of, well, what if we compensate all of the slave owners for their slaves? The problem was with cotton culture, and here in North America, the black population thrived, and the white population too, unlike the Caribbean.
That's right, or in Brazil, so a tremendous population increase.
So you had 3.5 million slaves, And to compensate all the slave owners for those slaves, you would have had to increase the federal budget something like 50 times. The tax base just could not have supported that. So it's a nice thought, but it couldn't be done that way.
And I'm not sure the slave owners were just suspicious of any efforts in that direction.
Yes.
Well, now the other thing to say is that the slaves were owned by a relatively small number of people.
Yes.
So and if you were competing as, say, free labor, if you want to say it that way, competing with these large plantations, their advantages of scale were so extraordinary that they sort of driven to the wall.
Yes, exactly. Something like 25% of all Southern families owned all of the slaves. And of that 25%, only a very small percentage owned more than 10. If you get to 100 slaves or 1,000 slaves, you can probably count on two hands the number of people who owned that many slaves. But that gave them tremendous economic clout, and political clout followed from that.
So just to, I think we're nearing the end of our conversation. We can make a few points that have persisted to our day. Is that these ethical evil that occurred? How do we respond to that? What do we do about it? It's been 150 years, and all kinds of events have taken place. But I think some of the lasting dangers or damages have been particularly to black families, Afro-American families. The idea of familyhood, yes, in a sense of slavery was a very difficult thing to maintain. And it would be
at the mercy of your master, and he was at the mercy of the economy.
And the idea of family units was not encouraged in this situation, and then many times families could be disrupted and sent to other places,
or parts of families.
Or parts of families. So it was a very damaging turn of events. Another thing that I think persists is there were lots of laws about teaching Afro-Americans, black slaves, to read and write. I mean, there are lots of restrictions about that. And I think one person of notoriety that overcame this was Father Healy. I'll just mention that.
Excellent story.
It's a great story, and I want to tell it if people haven't heard it. It was an Irish, let's say, military officer in the British Army, and he came to Georgia. He came to actually Monroe County, northern Bibb County. He had a plantation. One of his bondswomen became his wife, although that was illegal to do that, and they had 6 extraordinary children. And they, because they could not be taught publicly to read and write, they taught them at home, and then all of the 6 children went to Holy Cross before the Civil War, and they all had eminent careers. One became in the Coast Guard, became a great Coast Guard captain in Alaska, and the largest class of Coast Guard cutter is named the Healy. Mm-hmm. Another of their children became Catholic bishop, and another one, Father Healy, was the first Afro-American to receive a PhD right here from Macon, Georgia, and he then became the president of Georgetown University, and he did great things while he was there. His statue is in front of their major administrative building. So it is possible to do something, and I really think stories like this deserve attention as kind of a part of a healing process, however we can accomplish that. And I think that's one of the major problems of our country, and how to heal this wound. How do you do that? And it's difficult to do.
It'll take a long time.
It's very difficult to do.
Indeed.
Well, Bucky, once again, thank you for being here. It's great for our chat tonight. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.